What if I told you that the United States spent years, billions of dollars in policy effort, and the political capital of two presidents trying to build a wall around China's access to the world's most powerful artificial intelligence chips, and that the whole time the floodgates were quietly wide open? What if I told you that right now, as Washington congratulates itself on keeping Beijing's hands off the most advanced silicon on the planet, Chinese companies have very likely been receiving those exact chips by the hundreds of thousands, completely legally, through a loophole so embarrassing that when a leaked memo about it circulated inside Washington last week, officials rushed to patch it over a single weekend? Stick with me, because this story is not just about semiconductors. This is about the gap between what America says it's doing and what America is actually doing. This is about a geopolitical chess match where one side keeps announcing checkmate while the other side quietly keeps playing. And today we are going to break down exactly what happened, why it matters more than almost any headline you will read this year, and what it tells us about who is really winning the race to dominate artificial intelligence. If you are new here, hit that subscribe button right now and drop a like on this video. It genuinely helps us get this kind of analysis to more people. And if you know someone who follows the technology war between the US and China, share this with them. This is exactly the kind of story they need to see. Let's go back to the beginning, because to understand what just happened, you need to understand the battlefield. The story of American chip export controls on China really kicks off in October of 2022. The Biden administration, deeply alarmed by China's rapid advances in artificial intelligence and military technology, pulled what many called the most sweeping export restriction in the history of the semiconductor industry. The rules targeted advanced graphics processing units, GPUs, the specialized chips that power everything from training massive AI models to running the calculations behind modern weapon systems. Nvidia's A100 and H100 chips, which had become the backbone of the global AI boom, were placed under strict export licensing requirements for China. The idea was simple: cut off the fuel supply, and you slow down the engine. And at first, it seemed to be working. Chinese tech giants scrambled. They stockpiled what they could before the rules took effect. Prices of chips on the secondary market inside China skyrocketed. Nvidia, to comply, created a downgraded version of its products specifically for the Chinese market, the A800, the H20, chips powerful enough to be commercially useful, but theoretically not powerful enough to give China a decisive military or intelligence edge. But then came January of 2025, and with it, a moment that shook every assumption about the technology competition between Washington and Beijing. DeepSeek, a relatively obscure Chinese AI startup, born as a side project of a hedge fund, released its R1 model. And the global tech world went into a kind of controlled panic. Here was a Chinese AI chatbot performing at the same level as the best products from OpenAI, from Google, from Anthropic, and doing it, supposedly, for a fraction of the cost and on chips that the United States had tried to restrict. Nvidia's stock dropped over $600 billion in market value in a single day. President Trump called it a wake-up call. The entire assumption that chip controls were successfully hobbling Chinese AI development suddenly looked very shaky indeed. But the story doesn't end with DeepSeek R1. It gets much more complicated and much more consequential. In the final days of his administration, President Biden's team unveiled what they called the framework for artificial intelligence diffusion. It was the most ambitious chip control scheme ever proposed. The idea was to divide the entire world into 3 tiers. Think of it like a global traffic light system for artificial intelligence compute power. Tier 1 countries, the closest U.S. allies like Japan, South Korea, the United Kingdom, no new restrictions. Tier 2, a large middle group, including India, Singapore, the UAE, and dozens of others, caps on how many chips they could receive. Tier 3, China, Russia, and a handful of adversarial states, the tightest controls possible, essentially an embargo, on anything cutting edge. The framework was set to take effect in May of 2025. It never got the chance. The Trump administration walked in, looked at what Biden had built, and tore it up. In May of 2025, the White House officially rescinded the AI diffusion rule, calling it, quote, overly complex, overly bureaucratic, and a threat to American innovation and diplomatic relationships. Commerce Department officials said they would build something better. Nvidia's stock celebrated. The chip industry breathed a sigh of relief. And here is where it gets deeply uncomfortable for Washington. When the Trump administration scrapped Biden's framework, they did so without immediately putting a replacement in place. The old rules, the ones from 2022 and 2023 that specifically targeted China, were theoretically still in effect. But something critical happened in the gap. Or rather, something critical did not happen. The Bureau of Industry and Security, the BIS, the Commerce Department office responsible for enforcing these controls, stopped clearly enforcing one key part of the regime. And the gap it left behind was enormous. The rule that was left dangling was this: the export ban on advanced AI chips to Chinese companies was supposed to apply to those companies everywhere in the world, not just to companies physically located inside China. A subsidiary of a Chinese tech firm sitting in Malaysia or Singapore or the United Arab Emirates was supposed to be just as restricted as the parent company in Shanghai or Beijing. That principle had been part of the framework since the controls were first designed. It was not new. It was not subtle. But without explicit, updated, published guidance making clear that BIS was actively enforcing this principle, a legal gray zone opened up. And into that gray zone, chips started flowing. A paper circulated inside Washington policy circles last Friday described the situation in language that must have sent shockwaves through the Commerce Department. The floodgates, it said, have quietly opened. The document did not carry an author's name, but it described in detail how the overseas subsidiaries of Chinese companies, firms headquartered in China but operating data centers, cloud computing platforms, and AI research facilities in third countries throughout Southeast Asia and the Middle East, had been purchasing Nvidia's Blackwell chips, the most advanced chips Nvidia makes. Chips that are supposed to be flatly, unambiguously off-limits to anything connected to the Chinese government or Chinese technology firms. And they had been buying them legally, because BIS had not updated its published guidance, because the rules technically existed but the enforcement posture was unclear. Because in the world of export compliance, if the regulator has not clearly stated what it is enforcing, companies and their lawyers will find the gap and walk right through it. Chris McGuire, a former State Department official who worked on technology policy during the Biden years, went public on Sunday with a blistering assessment. He called the situation a massive loophole at the Department of Commerce. He said Chinese companies had been buying these chips, very likely at scale. And then he said something that should stop you cold. All of this, he said, was legal. Not a crime. Not smuggling. Not fraud. Legal. Because BIS never clearly said they were enforcing the rules that had always been on the books. The Commerce Department posted emergency guidance on Sunday, a Sunday, which tells you everything you need to know about how alarmed officials were by that circulating memo. The guidance stated, plainly and simply, that licensing requirements for advanced AI chip exports apply to all businesses with headquarters or a parent company in China, regardless of where those businesses are physically located outside China. The BIS said, quote, the answer is yes. Yes, we are enforcing this. Yes, it applies to Chinese firms outside China. Yes, this was always the rule. Nvidia, for its part, responded quickly. A company spokesperson told Al Jazeera that Nvidia had already been operating in keeping with the clarified rules, that their sales and vetting process was correct all along. The company said it requires licenses for shipping controlled products to companies headquartered in the People's Republic of China. AMD and Intel, Nvidia's main competitors in the GPU space, did not immediately respond to press inquiries. Taiwan's TSMC, the world's most advanced chip manufacturer, which makes chips on behalf of Nvidia and others, declined to comment entirely. But here is the part of this story that should genuinely make you sit forward in your chair. Even the emergency guidance that was issued on Sunday, the fix, the patch, the closure of the loophole, did not actually close everything. Maguire flagged another gap that remains wide open. The new guidance does not impose any due diligence requirement on foundries like TSMC to verify that chips they are manufacturing are not being made for Chinese front companies. That thread, that exposure, that risk, it is still there. The hole was partially plugged, but the water may already be through. One chip industry source, speaking to Reuters, estimated the scale of prior exports at hundreds of thousands of chips. Hundreds of thousands of the most powerful AI processors on Earth potentially reaching Chinese entities through third-country subsidiaries over the course of roughly 1 year, while Washington was publicly insisting the walls were holding. Now, let's talk about the bigger picture, because this is not happening in a vacuum. This is not a bureaucratic mistake in isolation. This is happening against the backdrop of one of the most intense technology competitions in human history. While all of this was unfolding on the American policy side, China was not sitting still. Far from it. The Chinese domestic chip industry, under enormous pressure from U.S. export controls, has been accelerating. Huawei, the company that the United States has spent years trying to strangle commercially, released its Ascend series of AI chips, and by early 2026, the appetite for those chips inside China had surged dramatically. When DeepSeek released its next major model, V4, in April of 2026, it announced something significant. The model was trained on Huawei's Ascend chips. Not Nvidia. Not any American product. China's homegrown silicon. ByteDance, Tencent, Alibaba, the giants of Chinese tech, were reportedly scrambling to secure Huawei Ascend 950 orders. The irony that American chip controls may have accelerated China's push towards semiconductor self-sufficiency is not lost on analysts. Every restriction creates pressure, and pressure, over time, creates innovation. But the reports about V4 also carry a more troubling undercurrent. There are serious allegations, unproven but widely reported, that DeepSeek may have used tens of thousands of high-end Nvidia Blackwell chips banned for export to China to assist in training its AI models. Some reports describe chips being acquired through third countries and even smuggled through disassembly and reassembly schemes. DeepSeek has not responded to those allegations. Nvidia says it has no evidence of it. But the allegations exist. And the Singapore fraud case, in which 3 men were charged for allegedly helping route Nvidia chips through front companies to obscure their final destination, suggests the practice of diversion is real and active. Singapore, by the way, is Nvidia's second biggest market after the United States. It accounts for roughly 18% of Nvidia's total revenue. But actual shipments into Singapore represent less than 2% of revenue because customers use Singapore primarily as an invoicing and transshipment hub to reach other countries. That structure creates enormous opportunities for diversion. Malaysia, a growing hub for AI data centers and chip manufacturing, has come under heavy scrutiny. The U.S. asked Malaysia to monitor every single Nvidia shipment entering the country, with Washington pressing for assurances that chips were going where they were supposed to go and not, as one Malaysian trade minister put it, suddenly moving to another ship. Now step back and look at what we actually have here. The United States built an export control architecture over years. It invested enormous political capital in that architecture. It pressured allies, it sanctioned companies, it put entire supply chains under a microscope. And then, in a gap of roughly 1 year, a gap created by the decision to scrap one policy framework without immediately replacing it with clear, enforced guidance, Chinese connected entities very likely receive hundreds of thousands of the chips that were supposed to be the entire point of the exercise. And even now, after the emergency fix, the guidance that does not force data centers to stop using chips they already received means that whatever compute power was acquired during that window stays in play. Those chips are still running. Those servers are still operational. The work done on them, whether training AI models, running inference, building capabilities, is done. You cannot unring that bell. Here is where the debate really gets sharp and where you will find serious people on both sides of this argument. On one side, you have the national security hawks who argue that this episode proves that export controls by themselves are simply not a sufficient strategy. If the rules can be gamed through third-country subsidiaries, if enforcement gaps can last a year, if smuggling networks can route chips through Singapore and Malaysia, then the entire chokehold strategy is more porous than a sieve. These voices argue that the United States needs to make a more decisive choice. Either enforce these rules with the full weight of the government, real penalties, real surveillance, real pressure on intermediary countries, or accept that chip controls are theater and focus instead on something else, like accelerating domestic AI investments so aggressively that any lead China builds through smuggled chips is quickly rendered irrelevant. On the other side, you have people who argue that even imperfect controls create friction, and friction matters. Every chip that has to be smuggled, every shell company that has to be created, every subsidiary structure that has to be built, it all adds cost and delay. It slows the adversary down at the margins. And in a technology race where being 3 to 6 months behind matters, even marginal slowdowns could be meaningful. The White House AI czar, David Sachs, estimated that China's AI sector was roughly 3 to 6 months behind the United States as of the beginning of 2026. If that gap exists partly because of the friction imposed by export controls, even imperfectly enforced ones, then the argument is that the controls are doing something, even if they are not doing everything. But here is the counter-argument that is hardest to dismiss. The Chatham House think tank put bluntly earlier this year, the United States has been pursuing the worst of both worlds. The Trump administration scrapped the AI diffusion rule, which had been the most comprehensive attempt to seal the leaks. By doing so, it removed the diplomatic pressure and the global framework, while leaving behind a patchwork of older restrictions that were clearly not being actively enforced. Meanwhile, Congress pushed legislation to tighten controls through the Chip Security Act, creating a confused, contradictory policy environment where different branches of government are pulling in opposite directions and companies, and their lawyers, are left hunting for gaps in the middle. And perhaps the deepest irony of all is this. By restricting China's access to Nvidia chips, the United States pushed Beijing to accelerate its investment in homegrown chip design. Huawei's Ascend series exists in large part because China had no choice but to build it. The very pressure that was supposed to keep China behind may have triggered the exact industrial mobilization that Washington feared most. DeepSeek training on Huawei's Ascend chips is not just a commercial milestone. It is a geopolitical signal. It says that China, even if it never gets another Nvidia GPU, is on a trajectory toward computing self-sufficiency. The timeline might be years away, The performance gap might still be significant, but the direction of travel is clear. So where does this leave us? The United States just patched a loophole that probably allowed hundreds of thousands of advanced AI chips to reach Chinese entities over the course of a year. That patch still has gaps. TSMC and other foundries still face no enhanced due diligence requirements to screen out Chinese front companies. The chips that already got through are still running, and China's domestic chip industry is accelerating regardless. What this episode really reveals is something about the nature of technological competition at this level. Is not a binary thing. Is not a wall that either holds or falls. It is a dynamic, constantly shifting contest between the people trying to build the restrictions and the people trying to route around them. And the people trying to route around them have patience, resources, and enormous incentive. The United States has real advantages in this competition. It has the world's best chip designers, the world's most advanced foundry partner in TSMC, and the world's most powerful software ecosystem. Those advantages are real, and they matter. But advantage and dominance are not the same thing. And a policy architecture that announces a ban without reliably enforcing it does not create a wall. It creates a warning that gives the other side time to dig a tunnel. The question that Washington needs to answer, not in press releases, not in weekend guidance notices, but in actual, sustained, enforced policy, is whether it is serious about this competition or whether it is performing seriousness while the real action happens elsewhere. Because right now, based on what we know, the honest answer looks uncomfortably like the latter. We are at a moment where the decisions made in the next 2 to 3 years about chip access, about AI development, about the regulatory framework for the most transformative technology in human history, these decisions will shape the balance of power for decades. And the people making those decisions need to be held accountable. That is why content like this matters. That is why you being informed matters. If you made it this far, do me a favor, hit the like button. It takes 1 second, and it helps this channel reach more people who need to hear this analysis. Subscribe if you have not already, because we are going to keep going deeper on the technology war between the United States and China, and you do not want to miss what is coming. And share this video, send it to a friend, post it, do whatever you do, because the more people understand what is actually happening in this competition, the better. We will see you in the next one.